The topic at hand today definitely speaks to my heart. I've been in the entertainment industry across the continent and globally for nearly past 2 decades, but at the same time also working strongly in the activism space, particularly women and children empowerment. And this came about from an unfortunate personal incident that happened to me, where I was beaten up by a boyfriend, and for so many years I blamed myself for what had happened to me. And so I decided to use my public persona to try and speak to these questions that I had in my head and realize that, well, if I'm having them, so many other people are having the same ones. And so I joined an organization called Power, which is People Opposing Women Abuse. And I did intensive training with Power to understand the dynamics of abuse, understand the myths and misconceptions, so that when I do speak to those topics, I'm speaking from a place of experience and of knowledge. And since doing that, obviously doing a lot of public work for Power, doing a lot of volunteering, using my public voice to create awareness and to create these conversations, and leading to doing a lot of other work across the continent. I've worked with UN Women, where I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro underneath the campaign Africa Unite, which is a campaign to stop violence against women and children on the continent. I now sit on the board of Power and using, once again, my brand to reinforce other areas of gender-based violence, from sexual harassment. Around the world, everyone is talking about the Me Too movement, about women within the entertainment industry, talking about rape, about sexual harassment that's been happening to them. And a group of us have realized, well, if it's happening in America, it's definitely happening in South Africa and definitely happening on our continent. And so through another organization called SWIFT, we're addressing these issues underneath the hashtag That's Not Okay, and basically calling on people not only to speak out about it, but to find healing, but more importantly, to stand in solidarity for people who do speak out. Because once again, that taps into the other misconceptions as to why people report domestic violence and so forth. So the topic at hand today is closing the gender gap. And I'd like to call up my panelists. And from UN Women, we have Ulamati Sarr, who's the Deputy General Director, UN Women West and Central Africa. Please give her a round of applause. Next up, we have Kemi Da Silva Ibru, who is the founder of WARIF, which is Women at Risk International Foundation. We have Dumisani Mgadi, who is the COO of African Union Foundation. Ndani Bofo Tawamba, who is the Executive Director of Urgent Action Fund. And finally, we have Jaha Dukere, who's the founder of Safe Hands for Girls. Welcome to my panel. I think before we get started, and I'll start with you, Jaha, if you could just give us a bit of insight into what your organization does and what you do for it.
Okay. You can hear me, right?
I can hear you, can you?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I started an organization called Safe Hands for Girls, and basically it's a survivor-led organization against the practice of female genital mutilation as well as child marriage. And we do a lot of work on gender-based violence. The reason why I started the organization is because for decades, there's been anti-FGM campaigns, but they've been led primarily by the West. And I thought African women need to be at the forefront of this campaign. At the end of the day, these are issues that impact our lives, and if anyone should be talking about it, it should be us. And the reason why it's very, very important that we lead efforts against the campaign is because we know our communities and we know our people. We can do this work from a place of dignity, and we can do this work from a place of respect, not only for our people, but for our stories, and change the narrative as to how things are talked about.
Beautiful.
So that's basically the type of work that I do. I do a lot of work with young people. I do a lot of work with survivors. And now I'm also the first regional Goodwill Ambassador for UN Women in Africa. And with the type of work that we've done, we've led to laws being changed in the US, we've led to laws being changed in the Gambia, and we continue to do a lot of policy advocate. And this year, I became the youngest African to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Fantastic. Definitely deserves a round of applause. Congratulations. And Dad, I think if you can let us know what your organization does and what you represent.
Thank you, Rosie. Can you hear me?
No.
You can hear me fine? Wonderful. Okay. So I'm delighted to be here. Good morning, everybody. I am here representing two organizations. My organization, Urgent Action Fund Africa, that's the organization that I run, and I'm also the board member of Prospera, which is the International Network of Women's Funds. I'm also the board member of Prospera, which is the International Network of Women's Funds. So let me start with Prospera, actually. Prospera is a network of 38 independent, international, regional, and national women's funds that are distributing financial and technical resources across the globe to women's rights movements, organizations, unregistered groups and activists. With these foundations, they're generally called feminist philanthropic foundations. So this is how it is that we're actually coming to be able to speak to issues of women's rights and closing the gender gap, because we are providing financial resources to organizations, you know, most likely organizations such as the ones that are going to be speaking here. I'm also the executive director of Urgent Action Fund Africa. Urgent Action Fund Africa is a Pan-African women's rights fund that is registered in Nairobi, Kenya, but is working across Africa. We use a rapid response grant making tool to be able to move financial and technical resources swiftly across the continent to women's movements, to women's organizations and registered groups and activists. With the rapid response grant making tool that we use, we are the only fund that is actually working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and have been able to move resources from Kenya to Tunisia in under 2 hours to a women's rights group that was participating during the Tunisian revolution. With the kind of grant making that we use or that we do, rapid response grant making, we are trying to ensure that women's rights organizations and particularly activists are able to see small windows of opportunities where they are able to advance and protect women's rights on the continent. And with the work that we are doing, we are trying as much as possible to be unlike any other mainstream funder that takes 6 to 9 months to be able to at least let or inform grantees whether or not they have received resources. We use a one-page application form where grantees can actually complete and let us know what it is that they're proposing to do, what their interventions are. And we accept proposals in 5 African Union languages, which is English, Portuguese, French, Arabic, as well as Kiswahili. We do have staff members that are dispersed across the continent because we use a virtual working model. They are in Zimbabwe, they are in Kenya, Burundi, Nigeria, and Egypt. I'm based between Zimbabwe and Kenya. And the fund uses her convening power to be able to bring together women's rights activists as well as women's rights stakeholders to strategize on issues that are topical, to strategize on issues that they have themselves prioritized. And with this, we have been able to convene together again with private sector actors, government representatives, as well as other stakeholders that are also contributing financially towards the women's rights and gender equality agenda. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will go to Dumisani. Please just let us know what you do in the organization that you represent.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just noticing a trend as I just came to sit here. No, it's a very interesting trend because basically when I grew up at home, I come from a very large family, with 7 at home, and my 2 brothers were never at home because of the struggle against apartheid. So whenever they come home, it will be a hush-hush that they're in town.
Okay.
But fast forward, I go to work. My first job my boss was female. Second job, my boss was female. Then I went to join the African Union. My boss was Dr. Dlamini Zuma, another female. And the first
You're
one,
blessed.
come to our office, you will see a staff of about 6 people, 4 ladies, myself, and then the other male is our consultant. So this morning I come to the session here, I'm the only
Howard to you.
But I think very interesting, having had a chance to work at the African Union Foundation, we get to a situation where we were dreaming, you know, in the sense of thinking about how do you want the Africa to look like in the next 50 years.
Yeah.
And that is a framework which is the vision for the continent, which is the Agenda 2063. And really part of that vision reminds us that we're not going to, if we want to succeed and want to see the Africa we want, if we decide to go and try to achieve that and leave 50%, in fact more than 50%, which is women, out of the equation, you're not going to achieve that. So I think for me, it kind of like, that's the type of work that we do where we have to look in terms of how we move forward, and then the issue of women empowerment becomes a big issue. I mean, I didn't tell you that at home. I mean, I'm just married with 2 girls, so it's been 3 against 1 as well. So I'm used to this idea, but that's what we do in the African Union. We look in terms of the programs that are working in terms of empowering women in the continent. So we're looking at various things, and I think also it gives us a chance to see how we can improve. I mean, you know the situation in our continent, we don't have many women president. I mean, I was so delighted this morning to see Excellency, the former president of Mauritius, is among the few women I've met in my work. Of course, I have also met Madam Selif, Excellency Selif as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. You're most welcome. Next up, Ulimati, could you let us know what you do and what you do for the UN Women?
Thank you so much. So my name is Oulimata Sarr. I am from Senegal. I consider myself a South African. I lived 15 years in this country. I work for UN Women. UN Women is the youngest agency in the UN system. It was founded in 2010. And our role, our mandate, is to promote gender equality and women empowerment around the world. We do that through 5 main pillars. We address the issue of women leadership and political participation, so representation is extremely important. We tackle the issue of women economic empowerment. We deal with women's rights and ending violence against women. One of our most important pillars, especially in my region, I cover Western Central Africa, is ending violence against women and in the context of peace and security and humanitarian action. As we know, women are agents of peace. We'll talk about that later. And of course, when we talk about resources, how do we incentivize governments to have a gender-responsive budgeting? We want them to have data that clearly states, this is our budget for the country and this is the impact it is having on women. So that's my full-time job.
Beautiful. And lastly, Kemi De Silva, who's the founder of WARIF. Tell us more about what Women at Risk at International Foundation is all about.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. So my name, as you said, is Kemi De Silva Ibru, and I'm from Nigeria. My background is obstetrics and gynecology. And the Women at Risk International Foundation is an organization that was founded 2 years ago in response to the high incidence of rape and sexual violence found in Nigeria. And the statistics in Nigeria that we work with today tells us that 25% of our population have had one episode of rape or sexual violence before the age of 18. Now, we're 190 million people, and 50% of us are women. That's an average of 10,000 girls every day. The organization works under 3 main pillars. Immediate intervention. We have a rape crisis center in Lagos State, and that's the second rape crisis center ever developed. To date, we've seen over 500 beneficiaries. We work in the educational sector as well as a community service. And this is one that's very personal to me, because Nigeria is still 54% rural. And so we work with local midwives, traditional birth attendants, with actually the sponsorship from some of the people in the room. And we've been able to train 500 of these midwives. And we've sent them back into communities that ordinarily we would never know or hear about. And we're able to record the data, which again is very key, because we're not known for recording data on situations and cases like this. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. To kickstart the conversation, I'm going to start with you, Dumisani, because as much as we need the stronger voices and women need to speak out about these issues, we also need to change the narrative, specifically coming from a male perspective. And I'd like you to talk about how as African men, what message needs to be sent out, and how do you feel the narrative needs to change?
Thank you. I think there are a couple of things. I mean, if you look at, for instance, there are still challenges that we face that we need to go over as men. I mean, yesterday, for instance, we had the march. And
The total shutdown.
Total shutdown march. And within a few days, we're going to be commemorating 62 years since 1956, the Women's March. And you look at the issues are still the same. It means there's something we need to be doing. You look at other areas, I mean, we need to really focus on education. I mean, the previous panel, they spoke very much about the importance of education as an equalizer in the society. And we need to constantly focus on making sure that women do go to areas where they've always been male-dominated, with the science, engineering, technology. I mean, and maths, that's the area we need to be focusing on. I think also, in order for what we have seen, I mean, I've just gone around the continent, I've met so many young mayors, and largely were male. And the reason being, the interventions that were made earlier, when we were talking about young people, they are not the leaders of tomorrow, they are leaders of today. So interventions were made that were specifically creating the type of leadership that we wanted to be young. And I think there's still not sufficient intervention around ensuring that women get to participate or leaders become leaders as well. If we are serious about it, we can make serious intervention, for instance, across political parties, number one, if it's political space, to say we need to ensure that, especially primaries, you saw it in Zimbabwe, only 9% of candidates were female. And that's a huge backwardness that we're going to, because it means 91% is male, just primaries. So if you begin to have intervention that will look in terms of primaries, that will come up with programs and funding that will ensure that women participation across the political spectrum is encouraged and supported, we're not going to achieve what we are seeing now with young people. Same if I want to visit Zimbabwe again. Yes, we have Nelson Chamisa. How old is he? That's 40 years old. So that means the programs that we put on developing leadership, young leadership, are working, because you're starting to see mayors across the continent. The mayor of Windhoek is a young man. The mayor of Mozambique in Kilimani is also a young man. But we now need to say we need to make serious intervention in ensuring, especially on education, science, technology. We need to ensure that, because the more the pool to choose from, it's the way to go. That's the type of intervention that we need to make, especially around issues. I mean, this morning we all had breakfast, and 80% of that breakfast come from women. In terms of agriculture in the continent, it is women that are involved in that space. But they're not owning the land, unfortunately. So we need to change certain things to make sure, and that those programs must be deliberate to women empowerment.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Jaha, I want to go to you, and I mean, a lot of the work you deal with is about female genital mutilation. And there's a misconception that it only happens in a certain part of Africa, where it actually happens across Africa. And this has come about from generations of tradition and culture. How have you tackled that area without coming across as being disrespectful and bringing about the change within your communities?
I think, first of all, it's very important that I am a woman from that community.
Yeah.
And I'm not someone who doesn't know what it feels like to live with FGM. I went through it when I was 1 week old. So when I come at it, I don't come at it from a place of attack to my community or to my parents.
Powerful.
I come at it from a place of knowing what this practice is and knowing that I love my culture, I love my tradition. Everyone that knows me knows that I love being African. It's who I am. But this is one tradition that we don't want to carry forward. This is one tradition that we choose will not happen to our daughters.
Yeah.
And I think for us, forming a movement that's truly Africa-led, not one where people dictate to us what we talk about and how we talk about it, but for us as African women, taking that stance. And FGM is not just a problem in Africa. It happens in the Middle East, it happens in Southeast Asia. Currently, Indonesia has the largest population of women who have been subjected to FGM, but we always paint it as an African issue, those barbaric people that are just there butchering their children, and that's not who we are. So I think part of the work that we're doing is changing that narrative and also showing that African women are capable of tackling their own issues.
Yeah.
We need the support from the West, but it's not the responsibility of the West to end these practices for us.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I'll go to Ulumati, just following on that book, coming from a UN woman perspective. And you mentioned about women being agents of peace. Let's move on about that and unpack those issues.
Thank you. And before I answer your question, I would like to add something to the role of men. I just give a bit of history. That will be a good segue into peace and security. 1995, defining moment for women around the world, big meeting in Beijing where women said women's right is human rights. It was a very famous speech from Hillary Clinton. You fast forward 2003, Maputo Protocol, ending violence against women, women empowerment. Most of our African countries are signatory of the protocol. 2015, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. We are very lucky as women. We are the only group that have a whole SDG dedicated to us. And I always try to tell women, remember your only one SDG, that would be your number 5. Today, we are almost Beijing plus 20 years. We're celebrating Beijing plus 25 in a couple of years. And we are still at a standstill. Progress has been made, but if we're still having a panel like this, talking about gender equality and gender gap, we have a problem. And I think that's when the paradigm shift happened, where we realize as women, if we want to achieve gender equality, we need to enroll the men with us. We want them to be our he for she, and we want them to stand with us and say, I stand by my wife, I stand by my daughter, I stand by my sister. Those are our champions because we used to do our toying alone, and we want today to enroll them together with us, to stand and say, I don't think this is right. I have a very good friend in the audience that would not sit on a panel that is all male. He will say, are you sure that on this subject matter you cannot even find a woman to talk about it? Now let's talk about peace and security. My region is really at the epicenter of violent extremism. So I cover West and Central Africa, and you know, as the Sahel, Boko Haram, ATMI. And then you will look at peace negotiations, and you would not see a single woman at the table. And us, we are convinced that the women who are in the community are the agents of peace, and they can anchor the young people on peace. We actually even use the women as our early warning system. We realize in some of these African countries, when we start seeing a lot of gold on the market, we know that attacks are going to happen because the women are selling their jewelry to fund the violence extremism. So we created, as UN Women, what we call the G5 platform for peace. This is the 5 countries in the Sahel that are the most affected by violence extremism. That's Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, you name it, and Chad. And the idea is to take women parliamentarians, women in civil society organizations, to talk together to be able to convince young men and women that violence extremism is not the way out. I'm sure we'll talk about it during the panel, but the biggest threat to peace is poverty. So in order to sort out the peace and security issue in the Sahel, to use women as agents of peace is extremely important to address the issue of economic empowerment. But I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Thank you very much for that. Kemi, I'd like to turn to you and looking at the various social and cultural practices that have adverse effects on gender equality in the context of physical and sexual violence against women. What steps do we need to take in order to address those practices from a West African point of view,
right.
because you're speaking from that?
Well, traditional norms and customs are a part of every African community, every African country. And they're a reflection of our beliefs, our values. And ordinarily, when it's in benefit of the whole community, it's a wonderful thing. Like you mentioned, being an African woman and being proud of an African woman. I mean, the classic example that comes to my mind is Ubuntu, when we talk about community giving. And we relate to it in every African country, and it's something that we practice. However, what tends to happen is some of these practices are harmful, especially in the context of MySpace, gender-based violence. A classic example is one we mentioned, the female genital mutilation. If I put on my OBGYN hat as a specialist, I have seen firsthand young girls that have undergone this awful procedure, and I've had to repair many of these young girls. I mean, this is at a risk of infection and death, and so we then wonder about the maternal mortality rates that therefore occur because of these practices, and that impact on gender equality and just being a woman. I mean, there are other practices that we're familiar with. There's the early child marriages that we see in the northern part of Nigeria. And believe in other African countries, there's similar practices. I read somewhere in Zambia, there's this sexual cleansing after the first period, which is similar. We also have the paying of brides, the lobola, I believe it's called in South Africa. I mean, in Nigeria, a man in a rural area that pays for his bride, in his mind, there's an ownership attached to that. So all of these practices, by and large, encourage women to be placed in this vulnerable position. And African countries are patriarchal. I mean, men are and still are the ones making the decisions at the detriment of women. And so when we have these practices, and we have this practice in the context of this African man already believing that he has this entitlement issues, then we do have issues with female inequality, and we do have an equity problem. And so we need to start looking at our customs and our practices. We celebrate the ones that are positive, but we need to address the ones that are harmful. Otherwise, we will never change the narrative of this problem.
Thank you for that. And Dan, I want to turn to you and looking at how the importance of the collaboration between a women's fund and the private sector, and what models, because it's coming from your expertise, what models have worked effectively to create this?
Thank you, Rosie. So let me start by sharing one of my favorite African proverbs that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. Within the African Feminist Philanthropic Foundations, we believe that it is actually urgent and necessary in this political economy and in this era of shrinking of civil society space to be able to collaborate with private sector actors that are interested in investing in achieving gender equality and women's rights. And we have observed that there is a lot of narrative that is coming out of the private sector with regards how it is that they're all interested in investing in women's rights and gender equality. And yet what we also have observed is that we don't seem to be dancing to the same tune. We don't seem to be dancing in concert with each other in terms of the efforts that we are propelling in achieving gender equality. And with that, we find that most of the actors that are investing towards the achievement of gender equality are doing so in silos. So we find that the private sector actors are conducting their own kind of assessments and own kind of implementation programs that are seeking to achieve gender equality in the communities, the same communities that women's funds and women's rights organizations have invested for decades and have, gained a lot of insights, have gained a lot of expertise, have gained a lot of trust, have gained a lot of legitimacy, because we are also, even as we are women's funds, we are registered as NGOs, and we've been investing in these communities for ages, and therefore we carry a certain authentic and legitimate agenda and mandate in pushing women's rights and gender equality together with the communities. Right. So it would be beneficial for private sector actors to be able to collaborate with women's funds in seeking solutions, to some of the challenges that we're seeing that are bedeviling communities, particularly to do with violence against women, particularly to do with lack of economic emancipation, particularly to do with the struggle towards land rights and water rights and irrigation rights and fisheries rights and many of the issues that women's rights organizations and communities are struggling against. We, as Urgent Action Fund Africa, have been collaborating with a number of private sector actors, ranging from media, private sector actors, business schools in academia, working with organizations or companies in the financial services sector, particularly when it comes to issues of women's economic empowerment, to really ensuring that women gain financial literacy skills, but also are able to access, resources that the financial institutions are providing, but using, I think, models that are facilitating and observing of the dynamics and factors that debilitate women to be able to access collateral and loans at the same pace as men who have ordinarily had the opportunities to access these resources. Advantages, exactly. So we are also working with technology companies. Yesterday we heard a number of organizations as well as a number of panelists talking about technology being an enabler, to the work that they do. As Urgent Action Fund Africa, I spoke to how it is that we're able to move resources across the continent swiftly, and with our grant being our fastest grant having been dispersed within 2 hours of having received a grant application and being able to move these resources to Tunisia. We work with the financial sectors and use their digital infrastructure to be able to facilitate this. At the Prospera level, which is also at the global level, we are working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Hewlett-Packard Foundation, a number of Silicon Valley actors that have facilitated as well as put in resources into Prospera as well as women's funds. I'm sure many of you would have heard the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation announced that they're going to be working with women's funds to strengthen the infrastructure that they use to be able to push resources towards women's rights organizations and movements, particularly given this political moment in which we are, where movements have gained momentum and power to be able to shift the power, the powerful systems and structures that are not working in our favor. Yeah. So it is in collaboration with such organizations, with such entities, that we are seeing a lot of power being derived towards achieving gender equality. But lastly, I just wanted to share the example of how African Women's Development Fund, that is based in Ghana, and Urgent Action Fund Africa, being two regional women's funds, were able to also facilitate the movement of resources towards Ebola-hit countries in West Africa during the Ebola crisis. We were able to not only move resources, but be able to identify some of our grantee partners in these countries and be able to match them with funders, private sector funders that were interested in supporting the efforts and interventions that women's rights organizations were conducting to be able to turn the Ebola crisis. As many of you would know, and in fact I actually worked with Al Jazeera to be able to actually come up with an op-ed that was specifically narrating how it is that Ebola actually wore a female face, how feminized and the Ebola crisis was. And so I did an article on triple jeopardy, women, culture, and Ebola. So if you Google it, you'll be able to read about it. But with the publication of that article, we actually were approached by many African corporate actors that were interested in seeing how it is that they could work in concert with Urgent Action Fund Africa and African Women's Development Fund to be able to bolster the efforts of women's rights organizations on the ground in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And with the efforts, with the collaborations that we did, wherein most of the resources were channeled through women's funds, but also for those entities that could not channel the resources through
More importantly,
women's
it was a
funds.
collective
Exactly, the resources went directly to those organizations. But having said that, I think these are models that have worked. But I think it's very important for me to mention that, you know, the relationship or building collaborations between women's funds, who are mainly women's human rights organizations, as well as private sector, have not come easy. You know, yesterday we had Kagiso Trust and Ramaphosa Foundation speaking to how difficult it is to actually partner.
Because there are different scenarios that are happening on the ground.
For
and,
sure.
And every region has different challenges, and so we need to tackle those,
Absolutely.
but get to a grassroots level.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
But also, just for me to mention that with private sector and women's human rights organizations, we are coming from politically different philosophical alignments. So it is very important for us to negotiate power, you know, and boundaries in terms of how it is that we're going to tackle
and looking at our
collaborate.
history and our
Yes.
culture behind it.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. We have time for a few questions, so I'd like to take it to the ground. I see a very eager hand at the back there. It's coming from a male perspective. We need
Absolutely.
stronger African voice. And then the
That's
second
right.
is the lady here in the beautiful mustard jacket. And then I see the lady at the back.
All right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
My name is Camille Olufobi. I run the most influential people of African descent, under 40. And I stand up today to say I am he for she forever. Yes?
Amen.
Amen. And here's the comment to every woman in the world. You are our mothers. You raise us. So raise us with the E for she model. I think the battle really begins there when you take the mantle right from when you start to raise us. That's number one. Number two, I remember speaking to Kemi yesterday about the work that she's doing in Nigeria. And I'm excited to offer an opportunity to do a hackathon. My organization does a number of tech events. So we do tech solves. So we believe that technology can solve a lot of the issues. So we do tech solve, a series of hackathons to solve the SDG goals, so 1 to 17. And until yesterday when I spoke to Kemi, I never really thought about the possibilities of number 5, for us to do a hackathon where we will crowdsource ideas to solve a lot of the issues that are affecting women, not only on the continent, but worldwide. So I stand on that offer and that opportunity
Thank
to
you
work
very
with you,
much.
to bring a
I'll hold
millennial
you to that.
perspective to solving the problem. So let's leverage
Thank you.
technology.
Thank you very much. The lady over here in the mustard jacket.
Morning, everyone. My name is Farai, and I work for an organization called Africa Matters. And just before I ask my question, just being here and listening to the discussion, I just want to thank my dad, if he can stand up. I don't know where he is. Yes, so my dad raised my sister and I. And the reason I want to thank him is because he raised my sister and I to be fearless, I think he is a feminist. He perhaps doesn't call himself that, but he's definitely a feminist. And it's fantastic to come from a household where you're encouraged to step into a space and to dominate as a woman. So I've always been very interested in gender and social policy. And when I was at Stellenbosch University, I was very active in leading the End Rape Culture protests. And I'm doing my research now for my master's, looking at how the Employment Equity Act affects black women in corporate. And what's really interesting is that a lot of African-based organizations and companies want to embark on a gender mainstreaming platform. So they get in as many women as they can to up the numbers, but the corporate culture doesn't change. And that stays the same. So you find that a woman has been put in charge of a deal on a Friday, and she gets back on Monday, and the deal has completely changed. And it's simply because she never went golfing with the guys on Saturday morning. So how do we ensure that we go beyond gender mainstreaming? What happens after we've upped the numbers? How do we change the organizational cultures that have remained stagnant for years and years? Thank you.
I'm happy to answer that. How do we go beyond gender mainstreaming? I think I mentioned it yesterday. To have any form of transformation, you will need to work on so many other issues. So if you talk about women empowerment, we call it our 3 R's. You will have to address the issues of rights, so women's rights. You have to address the issue of representation, and you have to address the issue of resources. We want to be represented at the highest level. If I take just economic empowerment, because we're about to end and we haven't mentioned it, we look at it as a model where you have to action a pyramid. At the highest level of that pyramid, you have women being represented at boards. So we want to be at the table when the decisions that affects our economies, that affects our companies are being made. Otherwise, our voice would not be heard. The second layer of that is that we want to be entrepreneurs. And as entrepreneurs, we want to have the same opportunities as any business owner. So in some countries like Kenya or my country, Senegal, people have what we call women affirmative procurement. In Kenya, 30% of public expenditure is earmarked for women, youth, and people with disabilities. So women entrepreneurship is the second layer of us being present. The third layer is about not being gender mainstream, but addressing the issues of diversity and inclusion. Now, in the corporate world and in the public sector, how do we make sure that we have this planet 50-50 that we are dreaming about? The fourth layer of that is women in this room will represent a huge segment of market. And anybody that understands market would know that they have to mirror their market to be successful. We are big spenders. We are buyers. We are buyers of insurance. And some banks, especially in Nigeria, Access Bank Nigeria, has a whole department banking on women because they know that we are the best customers you can have. We are extremely loyal, and we have the lowest numbers of NPL. And of course, women as members of the community. We want women to be involved at all stages of the community, of the decision-making in your community. And how do you do that? How come today, if you look at the picture of the African Union, presidential picture, Dumisani will agree with me, there's not a single woman on that picture. When decisions are being made about our bodies, child marriage, in Niger, the average girl is married at 12. Crazy stuff like that. Who is going to be the voice at the table for us? So I will ask the women in this room to commit yourselves. How do you commit yourself to being represented? Is making sure you're on the voters' roll. That's step number 1 of political participation. Because then with your card, with your voting card, you are able to choose who is going to lead us. We want you as observers. We want you in the electoral commissions. We want you in parliament. We want you to stand and say, I think I have a brilliant idea. I think I'm part of the solution. And of course, we want you to stand as presidents. And I always say, if every woman voted for a woman, we will not have that African Union picture.
That's very true. And also believing in the power of our voices. Do you have a quick answer?
I just wanted to add to what
Sure.
Oli has spoken about. Coming from a feminist fund, I think it's very important for us to look at the issue of power.
Yeah.
Right? It goes beyond women achieving gender equality and women's rights. We really begin to look at issues of social justice, really begin to look at how it is that we can dismantle the powerful structures and systems that are oppressing women, that are keeping women at the levels, at the bottom of the pyramid. Because it's one thing for us to have as many women, in the boardroom. It can be, some people look at it as a solution to have many women actually being employed by a particular organization. But as long as they don't have power, nothing much changes. So power actually, in a way, informs the culture of the organization.
Yes, thank you very much. We had a question over there.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I think this panel, you really touch a very raw nerve for me as a woman, because the issues you're talking about and you're touching on are real and have really held us back as women. Now, Olu, you had the extreme view that there has been no progress made since Beijing, and Dana, you say, oh no, the movement's activism is growing, there's a lot happening, we are making progress. So two very opposite views. Now, we know that in the world, the two most powerful positions one can have is either to have political power, where you are the president, or to run a big company, where you are the CEO. Controlling financial resources or power influence over people. Now, my question is, I think one of the most important factors that define us as women is the ability to be more authentic than men are. We have less egos and to deal with. So I'm going to ask a very personal question to each one of you. What is holding you back if you had the opportunity to have either political power or financial power to run a company? So I think it's nice to start with Jaha.
So what is holding me back? I am African, I am black, and I am a woman. I grew up in the US, and I decided to move back to the Gambia to do the work that I do. I run a grassroots campaign, and the work that I've done has received a lot of attention in the media globally. But to this day, when people hear about my work, they think that we're a big organization with a lot of money, when we are not. A lot of organizations in the West, all of our funding still comes from the West. We don't have any donors that are Africa-based. But even to this day, people would rather give an organization that's based in New York $4 million than give an African woman $50,000 to tackle her own issues. Really? That is one thing that's holding us back. Millions of dollars have gone into the FGM campaign for 30 years, and little progress has been made. But when it's now African women tackling their own issues, people continue to tell us that we are victims. They want to parade us around, take photos of us, and talk about how miserable our lives are. But they don't see us as change agents. So for me, that's why it's very, very important to be in a room like this. I am sitting in the midst of some of the most successful Africans. You have a role to play in making sure that we end violence against women. And we are your sisters, we are your daughters. We can't continue to beg for our place. And ending FGM is possible in my generation. Because as a young mother, if I decide that my daughter is not going to go through FGM, another mother decides that her daughter is not going to go through FGM, collectively, we can make sure that it stops with us. But we can't do it alone. We can't do it without resources. So that's why I'm urging all of you, and this is my call of action to you. People that have foundations, that have access to resources, support young African women, support grassroots communities.
Yes, louder for the people at the back.
You have all it takes to make sure that some of these practices end. So don't be about the talk. put your money where your mouth is and support us and these practices. We are tired of talking.
In the
That's
interest
it.
of time, I'd also just like to get a comment from Kemi to answer that question.
So what's holding me back? I think it's the mindset.
Mm.
I think if we have this conversation in many rooms, amongst different groups, we know what's wrong. We know why it is that there's inequality. We know that we need to change the narrative economically, like Ulia mentioned. We know that we need a seat at the table, but we have to change the mindset. Because if we don't change the mindset, then nothing changes.
Yeah.
I work in a gender space where women cannot speak out on the violence that they're enduring because of the mindset.
Yeah.
Because they've been ostracized and been encouraged to feel guilty and alone. The mindset of men. We've mentioned the patriarchal countries that we live in. The idea that women are property. We have to change that mindset. I work with young boys in urban communities, secondary school boys, and this discrimination is still deeply seated. And they still come with their entitlement issues, even at that young age.
Yeah.
And that's from families, and that's from homes. So I think we need to start changing that mindset. We need to start talking more about it, and we need to start reminding ourselves that we can do very little if we don't start very simply by asking, how do we change this?
Yeah. And in closing, Brady, I think from the male perspective, what's holding you back? And what's holding a lot of African men back?
I think there are a couple of things that hold us back. It's just that we don't want to admit the certain things.
Yeah.
We need to accept that women are, or human rights are women rights, or women rights are women rights. Once we begin to accept that, we would unlock a number of things. For instance, we have situations where in many countries women cannot inherit land. So if they cannot inherit land, they would not be able to use land as collateral or as any other thing to get loans. Yet, clearly, when we did with the clear information or research that indicates that if you give women loan, they are most likely to pay back than males.
Yeah.
And then so we don't give them a chance to expand agriculture. They're only working but not ownership.
Yeah.
So I think these are some of the things that we need to change. And then there's the attitude.
Yeah.
We need to, as male, to begin to really take this matter serious, that she's my daughter, she's my mom, and she's my wife, she's my sister, and it is my duty to protect that woman.
Thank you. One more. We're going to be kicked off the stage now. 1 second.
I'll be very quick, and really it's to end on a positive note. Our African philanthropists are playing a huge role. I always like to celebrate this gentleman who doesn't want to be known. He, as UN Women, he's from Mali. He gave us as much money as Belinda and Bill Gates, and he would not want to be named. He gave us millions of dollars because he believed that in his country we could make a difference in women economic empowerment. So my plea, my ask to all the philanthropists that are here is that let's walk the talk. If you believe that in our lifetime we can end gender inequalities and some of these harmful traditional practices, we have to make sure that we put the resources to be able to change the world for our children.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all my panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
But the conversation doesn't end here. The conversation doesn't end at this forum. Please, let's take this onto line. The hashtag is Bridging the Gender Gap. You know all of the social media handles. And it's not just about the conversations we're having where people can see you. It's about the conversation that you boys are having in the locker room. What are you standing up for? What are you allowing? It's a conversation with women that we are having when we're sitting at the boardroom and heading our companies and so forth. And more importantly, it's about how we're using our voice and standing in solidarity and doing something, being that change. Thank you very much. If we could just take a picture.